Good evening and welcome to the June 27th, 2023 meeting of the Abington Board of School Directors. I note the attendance of all board members, including Ms. Glasser, who is joining us virtually. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. The Abington Board of School Directors has convened this evening's meeting at the Administration Building, and the public is welcome. In consideration of the health and safety of the school community, this meeting is also being broadcast live on the Abington School District YouTube channel. This meeting is being recorded and will be accessible on the district's website and cable channel no later than Friday, June 30th, 2023, to allow the members of the public who cannot participate to view the proceeding at a later time. Comments from citizens will be conducted in person and by phone. Information regarding participating remotely in public comment will be displayed on the screen at the time of public comment, and the board thanks the public in advance for its cooperation. This is a place where we hold dignity in high regard. Your voices are welcome and respected in this space. The board met in an executive session immediately preceding this evening's meeting to discuss school security on the June 21st, 2023, and on June 21st to discuss personnel matters. Do we have any additional agenda items to be brought about this evening?
Yes, Ms. Brown, I have a statement and some information to report.
Thank you.
I would like to provide another update this evening regarding Abington School District's efforts to respond to recent concerns over school climate and student misconduct, particularly at our secondary schools. In our most recent superintendent newsletter at ASD Highlights and Happenings, I summarized some of our latest efforts, including short-term and long-term plans. I would like to take a moment tonight to just go over some of those steps for those who haven't had an opportunity to read the wonderful newsletter. So some of the steps we have taken thus far. In the area of communication, I hosted several student table talks at secondary buildings to gather feedback and perspectives before the school year ended. These sessions were similar to what I hosted for parents and guardians, focusing on topics that included what we're doing well and suggested areas for improvement, of course, from the student perspective. And last week, a community fair and forum of area organizations and leaders was held at Abington Senior High School to help bridge the gap between school and community. I would like to take a moment to thank those who attended, as well as the individuals who participated in our discussion on how we can support our youth in our community who face many challenges. Additionally, on our agenda this evening is our first reading of revisions to our board policy regarding bullying, cyberbullying, and unlawful harassment. You might remember that I shared at previous board meetings that I charged our superintendent's committee regarding bullying prevention with reviewing and making recommended changes to this policy. Committee members, including teachers and staff, students, and parents and guardians, met twice in May to discuss these recommended changes, and I thank them for their efforts so we can hopefully have a revised policy approved ahead of the 2023-2024 school year. These are just a few of our immediate efforts, but I do want to reiterate a larger list and more details that were published in the superintendent's newsletter that was emailed to parents and guardians on Thursday, June 15th. I encourage everyone to read that if they have not yet, as newsletters like this are a good source, and they come out quarterly. I would also like to point out that we are in a process of redesigning the Abington School District website, which will include a new app and other enhanced communication features for families. So keep an eye out for further information. Over the summer, we will be sharing that with you. Further, as this is the last board meeting of the 2022-2023 school year, just wanted to take a moment specifically to thank our parents and guardians for their support over the past 10 months. This year was largely a transitional year as we completed the Abington School District's grade span reconfiguration. This was a large undertaking and probably one of the biggest changes in the history of Abington School District. It required flexibility from our students and staff as they adapted to the new processes, and I want to thank everyone for their patience and understanding during this time. I also appreciate our families who've spent time sharing their constructive feedback with us, and it's my hope that we can continue to build upon these relationships together in the upcoming school year so that we can serve as models for our students on how to navigate challenges collectively. Lastly, the public orientation for the Abington Middle School feasibility study will be held at a special meeting which is scheduled for August 29th, 2023 at 7:00 p.m. in the boardroom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Opening comments from my fellow board members. Mr. Allen?
Thank you.
Ms. Frazier?
None, thanks.
Mr. Kay?
Nothing, thank you.
Dr. Mowry?
Just welcome everyone to the final meeting of the 2022-2023 school year.
Ms. Glasser?
Nothing at this time, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mohammed?
Nothing, thank you.
Ms. Fazy?
Nothing, thank you.
Dr. Kleiman?
Nothing, thank you.
All right, Dr. Fetcher, can you please proceed with this evening's honors?
Okay. First, I'd like to ask via the Zoom for Ms. Fazio, the President of Pennsylvania School Public Relations Association, and Ms. Farnham, the Communication Manager of the Chester County Intermediate Unit.
Yes, hi, good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank the board for inviting us here tonight to give out this award. We're incredibly grateful to be with you all to celebrate this achievement. I'd also like to thank Ms. Ali Artur for helping coordinate this achievement and us being here tonight. So thank you all so much. I do have a few words to share. Each year, the Pennsylvania School Public Relations Association, PenSPRA, provides an opportunity for professionals in education to be recognized in its annual communications contest. One of the awards PenSPRA presents is the Key Communicator Award, which honors a professional in education who has successfully contributed to and improved school communications. Today, I am pleased to share that this year's Key Communicator Award is Abington School District's very own Dr. Jeffrey S. Fetcher. I'm going to read some testimonials that were submitted for Dr. Fetcher's nomination. These testimonials outline the reasons why he deserves to be honored with this prestigious award. From the beginning, Dr. Fetcher's leadership strategy has been to meet people where they are and establishing communications channels and building relationships. This strategy has equally transcended into social media and other digital communications as Dr. Fetcher has demonstrated a commitment to expanding how the district reaches its families. By meeting families where they are, which is often on their mobile devices, Dr. Fetcher is taking the strategy that has worked for in-person communications and applying it to the digital world as well, showing he is key in enhancing existing and developing new communication channels for district audiences. Here's another one. In the fall of 2018, Dr. Fetcher's 90-day entry plan placed heavy emphasis on communications and learning through listening, an effort that has been ongoing today and serves as the backbone to almost all of the district's initiatives. Whether it's having an open house coffee event with teachers and staff at each school building during lunch hours, or allowing professional staff members the chance to customize their professional development days. Dr. Fetcher finds that the best way to approach something new is to include the voices of the school community, whether that includes employees, students, families, or the community at large. Here's another one. Communication within our district has undergone a complete overhaul. We have a voice now, from our parents to our students to our educators. Our voices are heard and respected. Dr. Fetcher listens and hears us. The students in our district know who our superintendent is. In their words, he's a fun, cool, and strong guy. He sometimes eats lunch with the students in the cafeteria. He can be found on the playground at one of our elementary schools, shooting baskets with the kids. He visits all of our schools regularly, and the students all greet him with smiles and high fives. His open door policy has made a world of difference. Dr. Fetcher is our leader, not our boss. A boss tells you what to do and you do it. A leader makes you feel like you belong and your voice matters. A leader is someone you hope to imitate and want to follow. Dr. Fetcher is our leader, and I'm so grateful for all the changes he's made in our district. And one more. Dr. Fetcher has been an exemplary leader to his staff, our students, their families, and the broader community. His open door climate and responsive nature of Dr. Fetcher has enhanced public relations as well as improved practices to support education. So on behalf of everyone at Pennsboro, the executive board, and all of our members, we would like to congratulate Dr. Fetcher on this, on receiving the Key Communicator Award. And just please join me in congratulating Dr. Fetcher.
I just want to say thank you very much, and communication is something that we need to continue to look at various ways to reach our audiences, and part of that is through listening. And I am a strong proponent that we cannot make decisions in isolation. We cannot create various structures in education without looking through various lenses. And whether that's, I learned so much from our students when they have an opportunity to voice their thoughts about how their school day runs, and also, our teachers who are on the front lines and there every day, and our administrators who will look at different programs and look at data and present that, and our community and our school board. And by listening to each other, we just become stronger as a school district, a school community, and we have to continually ensure that the various medium to which we reach out to people to have that communication changes as society changes with the preferred methods and the space that people want to exist in order to receive that information. So I appreciate that. I do want to thank all of my staff. I want to thank Ms. Artur for constantly making sure I stay updated, and as I said, she tries to make sure that I'm hip, but she told me I'm not allowed to use that word anymore because that just undoes it anyway. But I have a lot of people who are willing to provide different information to me, but also a willingness to talk. And this year alone, I mentioned in the opening about listening to students about attacking different things. We are not perfect. We understand that, and there are issues that we need to attack. And the best way to do that is to listen and find out from the lens of our kids who go to the school every day, and we need to hear that. And someone sitting in my seat may think they know their perspective, but it's only one viewpoint. So I want to thank Pennsboro for this recognition, but mostly thank the Abington School District community for all that you do to help in this process and truly ensure that people in this community have a voice, and whether it's here in the boardroom, in the classroom, or at a special event. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Another round of applause. Thank you to our Pennsboro representatives for presenting this award, and if I can just add to it, thank you, Dr. Fetcher, Just to add to what you said, another example are the tabletop conversations that you've had recently with our elementary and secondary community members, as well as the community fair that just took place last week. So thank you for that. It takes courage to both stand up and speak and sit down and listen. And as our fun, cool, and strong superintendent, you have shown that you can do both. So thank you for all that you do. Okay. Dr. Fetcher, does that conclude our honors for this evening?
Yes.
Thank you. Can we proceed with this evening's orientations?
Yes, Ms. Brown. Tonight, Mr. Lionetti, Mr. Vittoria, and I are prepared to present the 2023-2024 final general fund budget, which will include revenue, expenses, and transfer budgets of $189,967,156. And I'm going to ask Mr. Lionetti to please begin.
Thank you, Dr. Fetcher. Agenda items 11.1 and 11.2 recommend the adoption of the 2023-2024 general fund budget, which is presented in the form required by the Pennsylvania Department of Education in Addendum 11.1. As required by Act 1 of 2006, the Taxpayer Relief Act, we have advertised the board's intent to adopt the final budget this evening, and the proposed final budget has been available for public inspection since May 9th. Previously, the board has adopted a proposed preliminary general fund budget, a preliminary general fund budget, and a proposed final general fund budget. This evening, we will share with you updated revenue and expenses that are included in the final budget, the impact of the 4.1% Act 1 index tax increase, the impact of a 15% increase in the senior citizens tax rebate program, as well as a forecast for year-ending fund balance. In addition, the final presentation slide highlights the potential impact of the governor's proposed increases in basic and special education subsidies. This evening's agenda items 11, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19 pertain to next year's budget. Page 2 is a slide we shared with you as early as January 24th, and it kicked off the process of budget where we identified knowns, unknowns, and assumptions as we embarked on the budget process. As we are at the final stage of the budget, we have acquired all the information that was unknown with the exception of two pieces. The state legislature has not completed its budget. They have till June 30th, and we do not have proposed subsidy data for special education or basic education subsidies as a result of the negotiations between the governor and the two houses in Harrisburg. Your budget does reflect subsidy amounts that are equivalent to the current year amounts for lack of information. The final slide, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, will forecast the potential impact on the budget if the governor gets his request for subsidy amounts. So we've been able to fulfill all of these variables over the course of the last 6 months as we develop this budget. I repeat this slide also from prior meetings to just take a look at the general trend over the last 12 years retrospectively. We had periods of sustained or no change in the millage rate, where we would see differences between revenue and expenses to where we were expending fund balance, followed by a number of years of tax increases where we would reverse that trend and add to our fund balance and have it be very stable. And then most recently, back as far as 17-18, a series of years of no increases in taxes, and again, that same trend of fund balance being expended, most notably in 2021, when we were in the throes of the pandemic. Page 4 here shows the proposed final general fund budget that was approved on May 9th in comparison with the current year budget. I share this slide as a starting point for this evening, where we had $177.6 million of combined local, state, and federal revenue, an allocation of $8.9 million of fund balance to meet the $186 million of operating expenses. This next slide, the first column is the last column from the prior slide and has the same data. And this slide serves as a crosswalk for changes from the proposed final general fund budget to the final budget that we're asking you to approve and adopt this evening. With regard to real estate taxes, the Montgomery County Bureau of Tax Assessments provided us with the final assessed value for taxable real estate in Abington and Rockledge, and there was a $1.8 million decrease based on the estimate they had provided us in the December-January timeframe. That $1.8 million decrease in assessed property values results in a $64,000 decrease in real estate taxes. So while it's not significant, it is indicative of some of the impacts real estate assessment appeals have on the taxable value of property. I want to jump down to federal revenue. Over the last few weeks, we received information regarding the federal title programs, where we have about a $454,000 increase budget to budget in the title programs. Title programs are used for schools that are considered disadvantaged due to income levels, and those funds are applied appropriately for additional educational opportunities. The other $72,000, which makes up the $537,000 increase, is a carryover of ESSER's funds. Of the $2.1 million that we plan to expend this year, we didn't expend around $72,000 to $73,000, so it carries over till next year. Next year is the final year which we can use those funds for its intended purposes. Over the last month and a half, Dr. Fetcher met with all of the the budget department heads, which are basically the central staff that's in front of you, and our building principals, and asked them to reevaluate their budget requests to look for ways that we can appropriately reduce our expenditures as we move into the final phases of this budget. Those decreases consisted of reductions in supplies and equipment, fuel costs due to some successful bidding that had prices lower than anticipated, costs and reductions for transportation services, reductions in charter school tuition payments. We took a look at the number of graduating seniors, and it was a pretty significant number, and we looked at the typical amount of incoming students that elect to go to charter schools, and we found that we could reduce the tuition by about $100,000 there. We also reduced some administrative costs. We have lower technology costs due to some successful competitive acquisition of prices for Chromebooks for next year, which was part of an earlier award this late spring, as well as I already mentioned some administrative costs totaling $1.1 million of reduction. So we go from $186.5 million of operating expenses to $185.4. So the total operating expenditures and transfers in from the proposed final general fund budget to the final budget goes from $191.1 million to $189.9, about $1 million change. This net increase of revenue and the decrease in expenses results in a $1.6 million differential in allocated use of fund balance from $8.9 million down to $7.2, which is significant, which is one of the goals of this budget process this year, to close the gap between revenue and expenses as our costs have accelerated due to many factors, such as our collective bargaining agreement, the cost of negotiated benefits, and non-salary, non-benefits items in an era of inflation. Page 6 of the presentation is a comparison of the final general fund budget after the crosswalk to the current year budget. This budget includes a $7.5 million increase in local revenue, and that's occurring in three major areas. One, a 4.1% tax increase generates about $5.5 million of real estate taxes. Earned income taxes, we're projecting $1 million more than the current year budget, thanks to some calculations and forecasting from Berkheimer, who is our earned income tax collector. This is a trend we have been seeing since the pandemic, when we believe that that inflation is pushing up wages in our area, but also there are more people working in Abington that used to work in Philadelphia, and that's why Berkheimer believes we're seeing an uptick in earned income taxes. Other local revenue, up about $1 million. That's buoyed by interest rate earnings forecast for next year, because we believe, based on economic forecasts, that interest rates will remain somewhat in the same level, might maybe slightly decrease, but also would afford us some opportunities for some interest rate earnings, as well as transfer taxes and interim taxes related to real estate. So $77.5 million increase in local revenue is a significant increase. State revenue projected to go up at $2.3 million. That's, again, not because we've increased the subsidy amounts, because we've left them flat, but rather that salaries and wages are increasing, and so does the gross wage escalation of costs associated with PSERS and Social Security. So the increase that we experienced, the state funds 50% of that, and that's what is reflective of that increase in the state funding at this time. I already covered the federal revenue. Although it was an increase from the proposed final budget to the final budget, it's a modest decrease because we have less ESSERS funds for use this year than we did last year. From an expense standpoint, there's a modest 3.3% or stable increase in salaries and wages. That's driven by your collective bargaining agreements that you have in place. Negotiated benefits, we see a $2.3 million increase, which is fairly sizable. Over the last few years, we've enjoyed discounted rates from our CPAST. CPAST is the self-funded insurance group that we belong to. Those surplus-related discounts don't exist anymore, and we're paying the full freight of that cost. Fortunately, you may recall, this is the first time in many, many, many years that the employer contribution rate for retirement actually decreased and is flat. It only has a $16,000 decrease. The fortunate thing is mandated benefits being stable helps to offset that excessive increase in the negotiated benefits, where if we had seen a typical increase in mandated benefits, the two combined, negotiated mandated benefits, would have amounted to about the same, $2.3 million. So it's fortuitous timing this year. $753,000 for non-salary, non-budget items is reflective of the effort I shared with you earlier about reduction of those items, and it's just over a 2% increase. Your non-salary benefit items include most substantially your debt service, which is about $10 million a year. So there's about $20 million that's controllable by the folks that are in this room in budget, and it includes things such as fuels, cost of transportation, and things of that matter, which leads us to slide 7, which Dr. Fetchel will review, which is what's in this budget.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Lionetti. This budget includes many things that are up there, but I'm just going to highlight a few. Most importantly, a high-quality, comprehensive K-12 education and instruction programs. And This is inclusive of our staff positions, including salaries and wages. This year, this budget will include 3 additional guidance counselors, and that will complete having at least 1 guidance counselor in each elementary school. This also includes additional course offerings, and then some of our contracted services for general and special education, as well as our Abington Cyber Education, or ACE program, as an alternative for some students. Federal funds dedicated to learning remediation. It also includes our students in Eastern Center for Arts and Technology, as well as co-curricular and athletic programs, the mandated charter school tuitions, student transportation services, both public and non-public, utility costs, employer contributions to the Pennsylvania Public School Employees Retirement System, and district-wide benefits for employees. At this time, I'd like to turn over to Mr. Vittoria.
Thank you, Dr. Fetcher. So here we see that the impact on a typical homeowner with the assessment of $141,130 will result in a $198.76 increase in taxes compared to the current tax year. The bottom part of this slide, later tonight in Agenda 17.1, the board will be voting on increasing the senior rebate from 25% to 40% of the state allowance. The impact of increasing in the percentage of the state allowance results in a potential decrease for the seniors citizens of $1.24 to $61.24 in the lowest 2 qualifying income levels.
Thank you, Mr. Vittoria. One nuance that's not abundantly clear on here, the reason we have just about a 4.1% increase at the index, it escalates to 4.5% due to the fact that the taxpayer relief decreases from $430 to $426. So just due to math, there's an implied $4 increase, which results in why this percentage is in excess of the 4.1 increase limit imposed upon us by the state. Page 9 of the presentation is again in the first column, the final general fund budget. It's a forecast for this year in the first column, whereas opposed to the $10 million allocated for use of fund balance, we're projecting at this time just under $5.4 million, which has a positive impact compared to the budget on the ending general fund amount to $23.8 million. That translates to a higher than projected fund balance for the end of next year after you enact this budget and we go through the budget year as we strive not to spend $7.3 million of fund balance. The final slide reflects an increase of about $1.8 million in state revenue. That's what the governor had proposed, be the allocation based on his budget for basic education and special education subsidies combined. What that would allow us, it would have us look at an allocation of fund balance if that were to come through to fruition of only forecasting $5.5 million use of fund balance, again, which we would try not to expend even though we were asked, the budget implies the authority to do so. So I just wanted to put that out there. We wait to hear from the legislature in Harrisburg to see what those allocations will be. When we learn what those allocations are, we'll certainly share it with the board so that you are aware of the revenue that is coming our way that is not accounted for at this time in your budget, but will be in our actual work over the course of the year and eventually reflected in the audit that your independent auditors do. That concludes our presentation. Dr. Fetcher and I ask that you approve the budget as presented in item 11 and 11.1, 11.2. And if you have any questions, we'll do our best to answer them.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the board? Floor is open.
I have a related question. Mr. Lionetti, as you were going through the slides, you mentioned that the annual debt service is about 10 million a year.
Correct.
What's the soonest we can start retiring some of that debt?
Based on a question that you had raised previously, we had looked into that. The way we can retire debt is we have to live within the confines of the general obligation bonds as they are written at the time of issuance. At that time, certain years are identified where you can call back those bonds, basically force those folks that hold it to relinquish them at a payment amount that they are due at that time. Those opportunities are presented when interest rates are lower than the rates that are existing for borrowing today. So it's like remortgaging your house.
Okay.
A homeowner remortgages their home when they believe they can get a lower rate. Call dates are still several years in the future, and those opportunities will be examined with the administration here and our financial advisor if and when interest rates propose an opportunity to do so. We could start putting money away if we have surpluses, dedicate funds for payment of future debts, but that really doesn't retire the debt. So I don't recommend that strategy at this time, given what interest rates are, but that's something that we're going to continue to look at. I'm glad you brought it up. That's something that we look at frequently, what are interest rates implying, how far out do each of those separate bond issues, which we're paying on for right now.
Right.
Call dates coming up in the future. If the economy turns around and we see lower interest rates, there might be an opportunity to pay down our debt by refinancing at lower interest rates. That's the way we can retire debt. You really can't retire debt without a call, without the call provisions that are part of the original general obligation bond offering.
Would that be synonymous with a forgiveness of some sort? When you say call back, how do you
A
define?
call provision is a technical term within the municipal bond programs that you set at certain intervals when those bonds are offered for sale to those that want to hold them, saying that the issuing agency can redeem them at the value they are at that time. And the individuals that hold them lose out on those future earnings, but that's part of the contractual commitment that is made when those bonds are issued and purchased by the folks that hold those bonds. And various types of people and organizations hold bonds. Retirement funds can hold bonds, individuals can hold bonds. That call provision makes them surrender it. That's how we can reduce debt, not really pay down our debt. We can squirrel money away to pay down debt, but we really can't advance pay anything. We're not entitled to, based on the provisions.
Oh, okay, so we carry the debt for the duration of the time the bond is issued for.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. That's a helpful explanation.
Any additional questions or comments from the board? The floor is open.
I have a question on page 8 for the Senior Citizens Rebate Program. Could you explain a bit why the amount of money goes down that the resident would get for the two lowest income levels?
What that's is stating, and I'm sorry if it's not clear, is that the tax increase that those individuals who qualify for the rebate will actually see a decrease in their taxes because we're refunding or rebating back a portion of the taxes that they have paid. So the folks who qualify for this program pay their taxes if they're in the qualifying band and they're qualified by the state. We piggyback on that and we will return $260 to them.
But then the impact is the 6124.
Yes, because we raised the taxes 198. So the difference between 198 and 260
Got
is
it, okay,
61.
all right.
Mr. Vittori, am I doing the math correctly?
Okay, I didn't understand the way it was worded. Okay, I get that. The other thing I wanted to mention is I do appreciate slide 5 about it's 1.136 million that was like worked on with the different members of the administration to find that money. And so what's the process of that? How was that done for the different departments? What did they have to do? Was it that they had already created their agenda, things that they needed money for, and then they just went back and revisited it and just put things off for a time, or how was that done?
Those ways, thank you, Dr. Fitcher. Dr. Fitcher assembled us all in this room, and we passed out everybody's budget submittal, and Dr. Fitcher said, I need you to examine your budgets and find ways to reduce the budget. Some of those ways were by re-examining more closely estimates that were garnered back in the January, February timeframe when they first developed their budgets. It was a result of evaluation of a great number of the curriculum materials that were being proposed, and those were deferred. There was, again, the examination of original estimates based on more data that had been acquired from the January, February timeframe up through May. Some equipment and services in the special ed department were perhaps estimated robustly, and they were able to be looked at and find alternatives to what was originally proposed. So it was an evaluation of alternatives in many respects.
And then last, my third point, I have to find what slide it was on. Let's see if I can find it quickly. If anybody has any questions, they can ask, but while I'm looking for my last thing.
Is it slide 7? That's the only one I was going to comment on. I'd like to wait till last, though.
Can I ask a related question to the bonds?
Mhm.
So, how long, what's the duration of the 4 bonds we're still paying on?
Your 2021A has a I'm estimating because I don't have the information with me. We provided it, I think, in a recent memo to the board. I think we can revisit that. But some of them are as short as 6 to 8 years.
Okay.
The 2017A is going to go for at least another 20 years. That's the money we borrowed to build the high school.
Okay.
So I'll provide that information again to Dr. Fetcher and to include in another memo. where we
Okay,
should
I
do
can
it
go
in detail.
back, go look through.
I don't have that information with me, but in the ballpark in terms of the years. I don't have that.
Okay, so anywhere from 6 to 20 years.
20-plus years, yes.
All right, thank you.
And that debt schedule will show you where it starts reducing,
Okay,
which will help us to navigate borrowing in the future.
right,
As needed.
okay, great, thank you.
I did find mine, so on slide 8 again, if we could just go over, for the benefit of the public, a little bit about the Sterling Act credit and gaming, especially because it's 4.08 is the impact, and then on the average owner goes to 4.58. I'd just like it to be eminently clear of why that is.
All right, so if we look at the column labeled 2022-23, which is the current year, the Taxpayer Relief Act, which consists of the 2 components you mentioned, Sterling Act tax credit and gaming. You can see that the gaming credits that the state's providing for the relief is consistent at $272. The item that changed is the Sterling Act. The Sterling Act is the act that reduces, or let's say, provides resources to the school district in lieu of reciprocity for earned income taxes earned in Philadelphia by residents in Abington. So what we're seeing is a reduction in the Sterling Act because the earned income tax that I mentioned earlier about more people working in Abington that used to work in Philadelphia, the net amount of earned income taxes generated by folks in Abington in Philadelphia creates a higher Sterling Act credit. Because we're seeing less Abington residents work in Philadelphia and pay more of our local earned income tax, we see this $4 reduction. Now, what this is a revenue neutral move to the school district. This does, as you say, impact our taxpayers. And what I want to point out on our budget is the gross levy will derive $122.7 million of real estate revenue. However, because the tax collectors have to say, we're going to be reducing your bill by the amount shown on the previous slide, we're going to take $6.3 million away from you. We're not going to collect it there. We're going to collect it down here. The $4 million for gaming and the $2.2 million for Sterling is the same number. It's equivalent. So it's neutral. And when the legislators passed Act 1 of 2006, they put this together to say, okay, we're going to make the school district whole, but the state's going to, by funding the state that money, and the tax collectors are going to say, we're not going to, for homesteads, almost $14,000 homesteads will see a $426 reduction on their bill. That reduction is less than the reduction a year ago.
Okay.
I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does, it does.
Any additional questions or comments from the board?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, so this is Erin Glasser calling in remotely. First, I just want to thank you for all the previous orientations that have been presented regarding the budget. I found all of those to be really helpful as we're considering this final vote. And because of that, I don't have a whole lot of questions, but I do have a few. And the first one is just trying to get clarification on page 5, where we see at the top there's the committed fund balance audited 2021-2022, and then the estimated underneath that. And so is that, I guess, where, so 18.4 million is where we're estimating that we will begin 2023, 2024 with, is that right?
At the time that we were going through the budget process for the prior year, we had estimated that the fund balance could be as low as $18.4 million because we had a very straight line approach to calculating that figure. We looked at the beginning fund balance and then subtracted from it what was budgeted in terms of the allocation for fund balance use. That differs from the line above it at 30.8 because that's what our auditors determined with us what it was when we actually looked at total revenue and total expense. One of the criticisms of the Auditor General was that the process we were using for estimating the ending fund balance was too conservative, which is why slides 8 and 9 show a different estimate for the ending fund balance, which is more in line with what they recommended. It's one of those recommendations we certainly took from the Auditor General.
Mm-hmm. Slides 8 and 9 or 9 and 10?
If I said 8 and 9, I meant 9 and 10. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Okay, I see. Okay, so that's
So we've taken away that
fair.
estimate, and now we're putting in estimates that are based on an estimate of revenue and expense rather than just the budgeted amounts, which is why the number reduces from 30.8 to 23.8 as a forecast for the end of the current year, which then, as you suggest, that number carries forward to the next year for the 23-24 school year.
Ah, okay. Okay, I see. And then on page 6, where the line that is allocated fund balance under subtotal revenue, and there's a decrease there, is that also in line with what you were just explaining, or is that number different for a different reason?
That number is different for a different reason. When looking at the 23-24 school year, the allocated fund balance is the difference between budgeted revenue at $178.1 million and the operating expense of $185.4 million. The reason there's a decrease is that last year, based on budgeted revenue and budgeted expenses, we anticipated the need to use $10.7 million of fund balance. And if you notice at the bottom of that first column, there's your $18.4 million again, which illustrates, the straight line method we were using to calculate the end of the fund balance. The reason there's a reduction in the allocation of fund balance use for next year as planned is because there's less of a difference between budgeted revenue and budgeted expenses. So we're more tightly aligning revenue and expenses this year than we did last year.
Okay. Okay, I see. And therefore not needing to use quite as much of the general fund budget. Is that what I'm understanding?
What it states is similar to what you're saying. There's less of a reliance on our fund balance moving forward than we had projected in the current year.
Okay.
$3.4 million less.
I see. Okay. Okay. Yes, and I think that is all for my questions. I did have a comment that I wanted to provide regarding this budget, because I think it's important for me to articulate some of my thought process as I'm thinking through, what has been presented here and what we have to vote on tonight. And I think one of the most helpful pages on this entire presentation is page 7, which, really well summarizes where all of this money is going to and how we're intending to use it. And when I reflect over the past several weeks and months, when we have had many of our parents and community members come to the board meetings and also come to the table talks and also coming to the bullying prevention committee meetings. And I've had an opportunity to listen to a lot of community members and teachers and students talk about what is working and what is the highlight of their experience here in Abington. It is our teachers and our student services. And so to me, when I look at that first line item, so much of our budget going to that, it is really important, I think, that we continue to invest in what's working, because this is what parents and students continue to cite as the greatest asset to Abington and contributes to their positive experience here. And I know that we've had many presentations where we've also seen student achievement and growth information. And while we are not where we want to be, I have also seen that we are making progress and we're seeing tremendous growth. And, I'd really like to see us to continue to be able to continue to invest in that growth. And I know that our students are going to continue to need that support and that high quality teachers and staff to help them grow. And so I'm happy to see so much of that budget allocated to that. Furthermore, I also wanted to point out that another significant portion of our budget is going to programming for our students, which is the other thing that I've heard many of our students talk about as one of the most positive things that they have experienced as it relates to bullying prevention. I've heard many students talk about how having opportunities for pro-social connection, for positive relationship building, means a climate for them that is somewhere they want to be and somewhere they're able to make friends and find people who can support them. And so for me, an investment in this budget is an investment in our students and the future success of our students. And I know that we've had many parents call in with concerns about the school climate and about bullying. And for me, when I reflect on what are the three main things that I can do about that, I can ask as many questions as possible to understand the many sides of the challenge, which I have attempted to do and will continue to do. I can listen to as many perspectives as possible to figure out what can be done and what more we can do. And finally, I can vote in the best interest of our school and our students so that we can continue to have the resources necessary to address this very important and very complicated issue. And so for me, this budget reflects an investment in the things that we want to continue to see grow in Abington. So that's my final comment as it relates to this, and I will turn it over to whoever else has questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments from my fellow board members?
I have a question. Mr. Lionetti, if you could just explain line 16 in particular. If I'm recalling, that's a number that we've seen grow quite a bit over the past 10, 15 years. And if you could just explain that in the context of where a sizable portion of our budget goes and the lack of control that we have over that.
Certainly, Mr. Mohammed. As it states, $38.3 million of your expense budget goes to contribute to the staff retirements. Please recall that half of that amount does come in the form of funding from the state. This particular budget item has escalated significantly over the last 12 years, where this was in the $4 to $6 million range and has escalated to the current level due to the needs for the retirement fund actuarial calculations to change over the years because the fund was underfunded. So this particular budget, line item budget has eaten up a very significant amount of resources that would have been dedicated to education, and it was one of the prime movers of tax increases when there were tax increases necessary. And it looks like that this particular expense is going to be sustained at this level and increase for years to come.
Thank you. And line 17, right, the $10 million for debt services. I do understand the need to renovate buildings and provide for proper facilities for our students. And you just said we have some years before that goes away, correct?
That is correct. We will be paying significant amounts of debt service, principal and interest for many years to come. Those funds that we're paying back allowed for the building of the high school, renovations to Willow Hill, McKinley, and Rydell, new buildings at Copper Beach, Roslyn, and Overlook. And those improvements continue to be funded and paid back by the taxpayers to the tune of $10.7 million a year.
But that number starts to decrease, I think, in 3 years. Does that sound right to you?
3 to 5
20
years.
26, 27, I think, like it's starting to go down?
Or 27, 28. I'd have to get that in front of me to be sure.
27, 28,
27,
okay.
28, sure.
Okay.
One more year.
We can make it.
Yes, we cannot default on our loans. We have to pay, we have to pay those folks back who borrowed the money
Sure.
so we can make the improvements.
And the alternative is crumbling buildings.
Yep.
We can't have that.
Any additional questions or comments?
I think Ms. Glasser said perfectly what I was thinking, and I just appreciate that, our responsibility as a board is to lay out the vision for the district, and then, of course, Dr. Fletcher, your responsibility is to carry out that vision. And from my perspective, this budget very much does so. I think this centers the values that that the board has expressed as being first and foremost in our minds, and what we really think is important. And I think there's no question that having a well-funded school benefits the entire community, even those who don't have children in schools. I've met many people over the past few years who've moved into Abington because the school district is so fantastic. And so I just appreciate that this budget is, from my perspective, responsible, but also really does invest in one of the key parts of our community that makes us such a great place to live. So, thank you.
Any additional questions or comments? I have a new question, since my comments were stated quite well from my fellow board members. My question is, can you, and we've had this conversation before, but a healthy fund balance, what is that? For example, if you're paying your mortgage, they say you should have X amount of months in the bank to cover in case of emergencies. What does that look like in regard to our fund balance? And with the fund balance that we currently have or will have at the end of next year, what does that afford us? What benefits does that afford us?
I'm going to refer to slide 9, where I provide an estimate of ending fund balance at $23.8 million.
Mm-hmm.
This question was posed to our internal auditors about what they see across the Commonwealth as they audit other school districts, and their recommendation, and that they believe that a healthy fund balance is 3 times your monthly operating budget. So I'm gonna use just 180 million, because I think I can do the math in my head. 180 million, if we just divided it by 10, is $18 million a month. We have only $23 million right now. So we are probably a little low on the fund balance side as we've been spending it. There have been goals in prior administrations and prior boards to raise taxes to allow that fund balance to grow to over $50 million in previous years, but that was all pre-2006. And Act 1, where our tax increases were capped sometimes as low as 2%, which didn't meet the increasing costs of what Mr. Muhammad brought up, the retirement contributions, nor did it barely met the collective bargaining agreements at that time. So I think while rating companies would still be encouraged by a $23.8 million fund balance, it's not ideal, but very sufficient. Now, I think what's it going to be used for is, later on this evening, you have GASB 54 on the agenda, which designates fund balance, and there's 3 designations. The largest amount is for capital projects. As you know, we've been undergoing and sharing with the information that our consultants have looked at in terms of our assessment, our facilities condition assessment, and we have some needs that need to be met, and that's why we're dedicating the potential use of that money for capital investment in our buildings.
Any additional questions or comments from the board? Thank you so much for the presentation. Dr. Fetcher, does that conclude our orientations for this evening?
Yes, Mrs. Brown.
Comments from citizens is next on the agenda. Comments from citizens are being conducted both in person and by phone. The phone number to participate in public comment is 267-715-3717, and is being featured on the screen in just a moment. And it's featured on the screen at this time. You may call in from your landline or mobile phone. If there are speakers within the room, please be sure to state your name and address. There are mics to the left and right of you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Joe Rooney, I live in Ardsley. 3 minutes to talk about the budget is pretty hard, let alone the other 25 items that you have on the agenda, but I'll try and do my best. I wish there were some critical questions. We have 9 people on the board. We ought to have 9 different perspectives. The staff's only going to do what you challenge them to do. So here's my first question. What would happen if you actually voted this budget down? I know it's a hypothetical, but it's the last meeting in June. What would happen? We needed to start asking the tough questions a lot earlier. We don't have a revenue problem. We have a spending problem. If you look at that first table that was brought up by Mr. Lionetti, 121 million in 2010, basically, and now 12 or 13 years later, we're up to $178 million. So that's what, a 47% increase in taxes that you've gathered, and it all comes from Abington taxpayers. Whether it's filtered through a federal, a state, or local, it all comes from taxpayers. I would love to see a parallel table that shows academic achievement and improvement with that 47% increase in revenue, but it's not there. We're not getting a better education now than in 2010 or 2012. So that's the other half of it. We have a spending problem here, and until the board decides to address that, you can just already project forward where we're going to be going. We'll be $250 million in a couple more years. It's just shocking. For Mr. Muhammad, the way you control PESers is controlling head count. You ought to know that. So it's all dependent on how many employees we have. So if you have dead wood and you carry them along, that's how we determine our future. If it was underfunded at one time and then they increased the funding, and Mr. Lionetti can tell you all this, but it's controlling the head count is how you control PESers. Debt service for Mrs. Mowry, it's not going down. If you went to that June meeting last year, the school district is over $200 million in future capital projects that they're looking. And the way it works is as one old obligations get paid off, then they look forward to borrowing a new one to keep that a specific percentage of our budget. And all the big payments for the high school are still ahead of us. You should be scared of those things if you looked at them. It's pretty incredible. The other one is, on that last page when we talked about it, there's a $2.9 million, what was it, Mr. Lyon? What's the right term? There's a court case coming, litigation, that's what it was. The general fund, the fund balance is supposed to be used for capital improvement and to fix the problems that were in the PESers. But when 2.9 million comes up, this is what Tim DeFore was talking about, I believe. Money's just taken out of the fund balance to cover that $2.9 million as the budget went, and I asked Mr. Lionette about last time, as the budget went from 1.6 million to 4.5 million in that bottom line for other expenditures, it just changes from the fund balance. So you're just using it as a slush fund.
Thank you. Thank you for your voice. Yes, sir. Thank you so much for your voice.
I know you all are interested. You want to give me a little more time?
Thank you. As you know,
Interested?
there's a second.
We can't serve
I'm sorry.
59,000 residents.
I
if we
believe
don't
I
get
was
critical
clear
questions.
that your
This is
time was
hugely
up,
important. I
and
wish
you
would ask-
understand that there's a second time for you to comment. Thank you so much. If there's anyone else within the room who would like to comment, there are mics to the left and to the right of you. Please be sure to state your name and address. Mr. Lutz, can you confirm if there are any callers on the line?
No callers on the line.
Thank you very much. Dr. Fetcher?
I'd just like to reiterate that we reviewed what this budget includes, the major things that this budget includes, and we maintain a strong recommendation for this budget.
Thank you. I would just like to reiterate something that one of my fellow board members said in regard to the $71.6 million and how it includes the staff positions and PESers. Correct me if I'm wrong, but PESers is for our teachers, not administrative positions. Is that correct?
That's not, Mr. Lionel, can you review?
Can you ask the question
So,
one more time, please?
who's eligible for PSERS?
All staff that work greater than 500 hours in a year is the criterion.
All staff, so that includes our administrative staff as well?
Oh, yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to be 100% clear about who's covered within PSERS. When we refer to our staff, be it teachers or administrative staff, as dead wood, we take away from the fact that these are the same people who worked incredibly hard to get us through a pandemic. Their praises were sung by almost every parent for how hard they worked. And I just wanted to pause to say thank you. It is expensive. And we acknowledge that nobody wants to spend extra money if we don't have to. And Dr. Fetcher, you've done a great job with asking your administrative staff to cut where you can. I've heard over time that we have discontinued classes that were no longer wanted by students or had low enrollment, and we have increased opportunities where students have shown high interest. Most of what you have proposed has been driven by either data, student input, staff input, or community concerns. So the work that you do to create this line-by-line item to show where our money is being spent, I want to thank you for that. I also want to encourage you to continue to cut where we can, but not to the detriment of our students. So thank you. That concludes our comments, and we will move forward with personnel, which is agenda item number 6. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for approval of the personnel addenda?
I'm sorry, number 6 or number 5?
Number
6, okay.
Number 6, please.
Sorry.
No worries.
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the changes in personnel as reflected in Personnel Addendum number 6.1, confidential personnel and confidential personnel addendum number 6.1A.
Second.
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown. The personnel addendum begins with item number 1, the changes of assignment for 4 professional employees. Item number 2 is the change of status for 2 professional employees. Under item number 3 is a request for leaves of absence for 2 professional employees. Bring your attention to item number 15 in the retirements of Mr. Darrell Braxton, a driver in the receiving department who has served the district for 36 years. Miss Elaine Hughes, an aide at Copper Beach Elementary School who has served the district for 1 year. The personnel addendum continues with the hiring of substitutes, request for additional days for school nurse, compensation for interpreter and translation services, IEP meetings, and support personnel items. I just want to take a moment, as we are on the topic of personnel, to clarify that every time a position, we re-examine our positions constantly within the district. And the way that we do that is through data. And as we make recommendations here at this portion of the meeting, we have looked at positions when people retire or positions change to determine, one, whether or not the position is still something that will promote our achievement within the school district. The other thing that we do is look at ways of combining positions or redesigning positions to deliver the best program in a fiscally responsible manner. So every meeting when I go through personnel, these are the recommendations, but to get to this point, it is essential to know that there is much work and much analysis that is done before I will come to you and make any of these recommendations.
Thank you. We had a second. Any questions or comments? Ms. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mowry?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Vacy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Congratulations to our retirees, and ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for approval of the financial report?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the financial report for the period ending May 31st, 2023, as reflected in addendum number 7.1.
Second?
We have a second. Dr. Fetcher?
Thank you, Ms. Brown. I'm going to ask Mr. Lionetti if you could please review the financial report for May.
Thank you, Dr. Fetcher. As of May 31, we received $156.6 million of revenue, which is 92.9% of the $168.5 million revenue budget. Last year through May, we received $149.1 million of revenue, which was 91.4% of the then budget. Revenue collections are $7.5 million ahead of last year through the month of May. Year to date, we've expended $149.6 million of our $180.9 million expense budget, which equates to 82.6%. Through the same time period last year, $143.7 million were expended, which is 81.2% of the then $176.9 million budget. We've expended $5.9 million more this year compared to last year for the same period. With respect to our capital projects fund, the district paid senior high school project contractors $23,356 in May. If there are any questions on the financial report, I'd be happy to do my best to answer them.
Thank you. Questions or comments from my fellow board members? Floor is open. Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mowry?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Vacy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the motion for payment of bills for the period ending May 31st?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the payment of bills for the period ending May 31st, 2023, as reflected in addendum number 8.1.
Second?
We have a second. Dr. Fetcher?
Thank you, Mrs. Brown. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have regarding the payment of bills.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing that there are none, Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mowry?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Vacy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for permits for use of buildings and grounds?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the applications for permits for use of buildings and grounds as reflected in addendum number 9.1. All permits are subject to change per the provisions of the Health and Safety Plan pertaining to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Second?
We have a second. Dr. Fetcher?
Thank you, Mrs. Brown. The permanent addendum continues to reflect a request for buildings and grounds for this time of year. I'd like to bring your attention to two of those. First is permit number 346, which is the Abington Police Department will be using Roslyn Elementary School for a SWAT training on July 17th from 8 to 3 p.m. I want to note on that we will be communicating in various forms to our community that this training will be occurring as to prevent any panic. I also bring your attention to permit number 121A and the fireworks show that will be held on July 4th, 2023 from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. at the Abington Senior High School and Abington Middle School.
Excellent. Any questions or comments? Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mallory,
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser,
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed,
Aye.
Ms. Fazy,
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman,
Aye.
Mrs. Brown.
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendations for awards of contracts?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the awards of contracts as reflected in addendum number 10.1.
Second?
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown. Tonight, for your consideration, we have 8 awards of contract, 1 change order, and 1 Montgomery County School Entities Joint Purchasing Agreement. They are for food service equipment. The food service equipment is for the Abington Middle School, Abington Senior High School, McKinley Elementary School, and Willow Hill Elementary Schools. And this is funded by the District Food Service Fund. Food service kitchen smallwares, and that's also by the district's food service fund, Gmail migration licensing, Google Workspace for Education Plus, HVAC air handler and condensing unit for system replacement for this building, a school police vehicle, a secondary art and music instructional technology, and the change orders related to the feasibility study for Abington Middle School, and the 1 Montgomery County School Entities Joint Purchasing Award is for duplicating and computer paper.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the board? I have a
Can
question.
you,
No, go
hello.
ahead. Go ahead, Ms. Glasser.
Okay. Can you explain the Google Workspace for Education Plus? Is this, I know my daughter uses Google Classroom for some of her work. Is that what this is, or is this something else?
I'm going to let Mr. Sneed review that item.
Yes, Google Workspace encompasses Google Classroom and all things Google that we use. The enterprise licensing enables us to do some advanced reporting and logging. It also gives some additional features for Google Meet. It allows teachers to do originality reports and the like. So it's all things Google.
Okay. I'm sorry. So you mentioned this is going to be used for some advanced analytics that the teachers will be using.
It allows us to do some security reporting on the back end. It allows us to, if something happens in Google Classroom, we can see exactly what happens. It gives us access to the logs and reporting for our side of things.
Oh, okay. I see. So it's, what's the word I'm looking for? Sort of computer security analytics.
Yes, that's one large aspect of it, but it does have some teaching enhancements as well, or teaching ability with the originality reports. That's one of the features that comes along with the Workspace for Education Plus.
Oh, okay. Can you speak to that a little bit more, what that means?
The originality reports, when students submit work through Google Classroom, it'll do a comparison to other works that have been submitted from other students, both in our district and elsewhere, to see for plagiarism.
Oh, okay. Oh, interesting. Okay, yes, thank you. And then I had a question about the change order to the feasibility study.
Yes.
Can you explain why this change order is taking place?
Yes, we have asked to expand the scope of work that was required originally for the feasibility study, and that specifically is to gather more input from stakeholders within the school district and the community, and then also analyze potential next steps as a result of the feasibility study, which will be focused on in the special meeting in August as well.
Okay, I see. All right, thank you.
Any additional questions or comments? Ms. Glasser's last question was my question, but a bit more. Does that total contract cover what we expect of them for the duration of us getting the community input, or is it subject to another change order pending on what the community says?
It would be subject to another contract should you decide to continue. It depends on what path the board would decide to, a direction the board would decide to continue. So, for example, if there were to be a renovation or a building project that would come out of it, and there'd be work that goes along with that, that would be subject to a new contract. But it takes us up into that point to get that information for recommendation, and then you, as a board, would give further direction from that input. So it expands what input is in the feasibility study at this time.
Okay. Any additional questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mowry?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Fazy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation in agenda items 11.1 and 11.2 for the adoption of the 2023-2024 final general fund budget?
So I read these together? Yeah, okay. It is recommended that the Board of School Directors adopts the budget of the Abington School District for the 2023-2024 school year in the amount of $189,967,156, as reflected in addendum number 11.1. The following actions required by Act 1 of 2006 have already been taken on the following dates. Proposed preliminary budget available January 4, 2023. Preliminary budget adopted on February 14, 2023, and proposed final budget available May 9, 2023. It is also recommended that the Board of School Directors authorizes the appropriate expenditures of the funds as itemized in the final budget during the fiscal year beginning the first day of July, 2023, that the necessary revenue for same shall be provided by a real estate transfer tax of 0.5% and by a tax of 35.21 mils on the dollar on the total amount of the assessed value of all property taxable for school purposes in Abington School District, or at the rate of 3.521 on each $100 of assessed value taxable property, and an earned income tax of 0.5% on residents of Abington School District.
Second?
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown. Under tonight's orientation, we presented the recommended 2023-2024 final general fund budget. Mr. Lionetti and I can answer any further questions that you may have.
Questions or comments from my fellow board members?
I would just like to comment that this budget is a responsible budget, as was stated earlier, and I am comfortable with it, as I know Dr. Fetcher is careful in all of his spending within the district, and this budget aligns with my ideals of funding public education. So I wholeheartedly am going to support this with also the understanding that there is a control, budgetary controls put in, I'm sure daily. I don't work here, but we get reports from Dr. Fetcher, and it's very clear that spending is carefully done and when it impacts student experience and student achievement.
Any additional questions or comments from the board?
Yes, I would just like to add to Mr. Allen's comment and say that this budget isn't something that we are voting on it tonight, but it has been a process. It has been an ongoing process where we continue to look at this over time, and we get a ton of information, and it's something that I take very seriously in going ahead and investing in our students' education, investing in our community, and I believe that this is a very appropriate budget, and that it aligns with the mission of our district.
Any additional questions or comments? I just want to add that people move to Abington and buy homes here. The number one thing that I hear is education. The second number one thing I hear is diversity. And the third thing is taxes. That our taxes are not as high as neighboring districts, or we offer four-year kindergarten. That's another big, full-day kindergarten is another big thing. It is our responsibility to make sure that we hold the district accountable for spending responsibly. And we will continue to do that. We want to make sure that education continues to be the number one reason why people move here. And that diversity is also top, and that the taxes are manageable. I am proud that we are allotting more to our most vulnerable citizens through the rebates for our senior citizens, and my hope is that we do a great job advertising that and getting more senior citizens in to take advantage of that. And for that reason, I am also in favor of this budget. Any other comments or questions from the board? Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye. Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mallory?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Feasy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for approval of the personnel assignment book?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the personnel assignment book for 2023-2024, subject to correction if calculations do not reflect the appropriate bargaining agreement.
Second?
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown. The personnel assignment book for 2023-24 reflects compensations to employees and bargaining unit agreements and those established by the board for individuals not represented by a bargaining unit.
Questions or comments from the board? I would just like to comment that having this a public record speaks to the transparency of the district, and I appreciate that allows for people to question what they see. And again, that goes towards transparency as well as communication. So thank you for that. Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mallory?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Feasy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for the second reading of the non-public services complaint resolution policy?
I'd be happy to. It is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the second reading of the board policy entitled Non-Public Services Complaint Resolution Procedures Policy as reflected in addendum number 13.1.
Second?
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown. This is a second reading, and there are no additional changes from the first reading. I can answer any questions that you may have.
Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mallory?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Feasy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for the first reading of the bullying and harassment policy? I'm sorry, I missed one. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for the second reading of the school emergency operations policy?
Yes. It is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the second reading of the board policy entitled School Emergency Operations Plan Policy as reflected in addendum number 13.2.
Second?
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Once again, this is a second reading, and there are no additional changes from the first reading, and I can answer any questions that you may have.
Questions or comments from the board? I know there was one concern about the second highlighted section. The school district will also use methods of communication such as Skyward to send out a message. That does not mean you're taking away from other means or modes of communication, correct?
Correct.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. K?
Aye.
Dr. Mowry?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Feasy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. And now, Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for the first reading of the bullying and harassment policy?
With pleasure.
Thank you.
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the first reading of the board policy entitled Bullying, Cyberbullying, and the Unlawful Harassment Policy as reflected in addendum number 14.1.
Second?
We have a second. Dr. Fetcher.
Thank you, Mrs. Brown. The policy regarding bullying, cyberbullying, and unlawful harassment is being presented for a first reading this evening. I'm going to ask that Dr. Rosenthal, if you'll please review this policy.
Sure. As part of the required review that happens every 3 years, the Bullying, Cyberbullying, and Unlawful Harassment Board Policy Statement is being updated. The Superintendent's Committee on Bully Prevention met 4 times this school year and included a board member, administrators, teachers, other staff members, parents, and students. This year, the charge of the committee was to explore the causes and consequences of bullying in Abington schools, evaluate the effectiveness of current bullying prevention efforts, research evidence-based practices that reduce bullying, and update our practices, professional development, and policy and superintendent's administrative procedure. The updated policy is a direct result of this committee's work. There is a multifaceted approach occurring to improve climate and bullying, from monthly character education themes, bully prevention classroom lessons, and professional development, to having a kickoff event in each building. We are ensuring that students will visibly and holistically see and feel a positive and supportive climate this fall. Updated procedures in reporting and investigating, intervening, and communications will be in place for the fall. Monthly communication to families and guardians will keep our community informed, but we will also ask our community to support us, as we know it all takes all of us working together to make the biggest difference. This is the first read on the updated policy. The policy will be brought back for a second read in August, when the updated superintendent's administrative procedure will also be presented.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the board?
Can I just
I
say?
have a question. Oh, go ahead.
That's all right, Ms. Glasser, go ahead.
I had a question about the updates. I'm assuming the highlighted parts are the things that have been added to the document.
Yes.
Okay. So it seems like there's a big emphasis throughout this document on cyberbullying, where perhaps there was not previously. How are we defining cyberbullying, and how, what are the ways in which a school district can prevent cyberbullying?
Dr. Rosenthal?
Yeah, sure. So cyberbullying is really any bullying that occurs through an electronic device. While the district cannot prohibit what goes on outside of the district, we include it in our bully prevention efforts through our lessons, as well as if bullying occurs outside of school and is brought to the school's attention and it affects a student in school, then there could be discipline actions against for that.
Okay. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that I attended all of the meetings, and I really appreciate what the administration was doing. I really appreciate the parents and the children being involved, the students rather, coming in and contributing so much. I think that this is something we need to revisit often as a policy if we can, only because things change. The way people treat each other changes. So I applaud this and I appreciate it.
Any additional questions or comments?
To Ms. Glasser's point, and I looked up the PSBA suggested policy for this, and it does outline definitions of bullying and cyberbullying. Is there a reason why in this version, it doesn't have those definitions? Do they exist somewhere else in a separate board policy or superintendent's procedure?
Yeah, they are in the superintendent's administrative procedure, and so are the details of how this is implemented.
Is that something, though, that should rest within a policy and not a superintendent's procedure? Or is it no impact? My question is because PSBA has it in their recommended policy, why we are going away from them.
Mr. Russo?
I mean, PSBA's policies are drafted kind of a one-size-fits-all for 501 school districts, and many of which don't even have administrative procedures or regulations. So there's no need, as long as they're in the administrative, or as long as they're in the superintendent's administrative procedure, they're easily accessible, and that's probably where anybody who was actually going to apply the procedures would look in the first place.
Can I add something to Mr. Allen's question? So I agree that anyone internal to the district would go to the SAP. But Mr. Allen's observation raised a question for me about whether if you're a parent and you want to understand the outlines of these particular behaviors, whether it wouldn't be more helpful to include brief thumbnail definitions here, where a parent might be more likely to encounter them than in the superintendent's administrative procedure.
In terms of, if that's the direction, we can include them. We do have the policies and procedures next to each other, and they refer to each other when they're posted online. But, if it is the desire to, even create my term footnoting to terms within the policy, I don't foresee that as an issue.
It just, so from my perspective, if I was a parent wanting to understand the outlines of this behavior, it would be easier for me to access that in a single document like this, rather than having to flip back and forth between two. So it would be a more economical encounter.
Well, if I could. These definitions change over time, though.
Aren't they defined by PDE?
There's not PDE, but there's school code that has some definitions, and those change too. I mean,
Right.
So the goal is not to change a policy just because a definition or a law needs to change. That's why you put those things. That's why the very first sentence of this policy states, is free from bullying and unlawful harassment as defined in the accompanying superintendent's administrative procedure. This way, if you ever need to change the definitions, you don't have to bring the policy back for a first reading and an adoption. You can simply update the regulation, or the procedure.
But don't we engage in periodic review of these policies?
You do, but you don't, look, you can make a definition by policy, or you can make a definition by administrative procedure. It's not, either way is correct. Typically, though, you would do it by administrative procedure because it's easier to fix if it gets out of date.
May I ask, have we considered hyperlinking so that it goes directly to the administrative procedure?
Yes, right now, the documents, as you see them, are hosted on our website in PDF format. And Mr. Steed, you can help me with this in terms of, as we transition to the new website, they will need to be hosted on board docs. In terms of hyperlinking on that, can you weigh in on that in terms of from a tech standpoint? I just don't want to say something that we can't do.
I believe it's possible. We've only begun to explore that avenue, but from what I've seen, it certainly looks like it's possible.
I guess my question is, Mr. Roos, in terms of, can you, on the policy page itself, can you refer to the SAP, separately on that same page? So in other words, as defined in the SAP as, and put the definition there. So then, therefore, if the definition changes within the SAP, you can change it without changing the policy. So can you refer to the SAP within the policy?
First sentence, you do that.
Yeah, but I mean specifically, like,
Explicitly.
yeah, at the end, can you put according to the superintendent's administrative procedure, cyberbullying is defined as?
I'm sorry, I feel like I'm being dense here. The first sentence says, as cyberbullying, bullying, as defined in the accompanying superintendent procedure.
Comma.
I'm not sure how you could state it any more clearly than that.
Right. I'm simply referring to having the information on the same page so that, the SAP information would appear on that
You
same
can
page.
put you can put it all together. In the SAP, if you look at the SAP, it's almost 2 pages worth of definitions. So you could absolutely embed the definitions in that policy 2 pages. But then by the time you got to reading the guidelines, you'd already be on page 3. And that may or may not be as user-friendly as you want it to be.
Can you do a C definitions below?
You can,
I think-
you can do whatever you want. I'm just suggesting the why it's done this way, why it's typically done this way.
If I may make a suggestion, as this is a first reading, we can work on a couple iterations of the document and present them at the next board meeting for your approval. So I can make sure that, one, we can do that, so whether it's hyperlinked or see below or remains, how it is, those options I'd like to be able to present to you for your discussion in the second reading. As I hear that there are concerns with the policy not being explicit to the definition, having the definitions. So we can do that at the next meeting if that is the desire of the board.
Mr. Roos, can you provide guidance as to how we should proceed if we are recommending a delay?
It would be for the second reading. So,
Okay.
So this is a first reading. It does not accept the policy. It is an opportunity for us to present to you what is recommended for your deliberation on the first policy, or in the first reading, with the understanding that at the second reading, we would take into account your direction as the Board of School Directors for this policy.
Although, if you substantially revise a policy between first and second reading, you need a new first reading, according to your policy on policies.
Right.
Table it for now.
Would adding the
Starting to
definition,
sound Dickensian.
So I guess my question is, if we're talking about format and location, we are not changing the purpose or the guidelines within a policy. So does that significantly change the policy to require another first reading?
What do you want the answer to be? I mean,
I am
you
comfortable with.
decide what's a substantial revision, not the law.
I think it would just be clarification and elaboration. It would not substantively change the meaning
No, not at all.
of the policy or the procedure.
And my question was kind of the lines of, was there any, did the power need to lay within a policy or within a superintendent's procedure? That was kind of where I was coming from, because I saw PSBA had those definitions within a policy. But if they're still in force through a superintendent's procedure, I mean, that is okay for me. I also agree, I like the idea of connecting. The reality is there's a hyper focus right now on bullying, and we're about to set forth a policy on to include cyberbullying. To have a very comprehensive one-stop shop is beneficial for the community. I did look at the superintendent's procedure. It is extremely comprehensive. As Mr. Roos says, it's multiple pages long. In trying to make things easy and concise for the community, just having it in one spot is beneficial. As ridiculous as it might sound in terms of going through multiple reads, Dr. Fetcher, you've put a huge focus on anti-bullying behaviors. I think that it just goes with easy communication to people that everything's in one spot.
So I am comfortable recommending to you that we will bring some options that aren't major changes within the policy to the second reading, if legally that is acceptable.
Your decision, what's legal. It's your policy, it's not a law.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow, on that note.
It's your,
Sorry.
this isn't governed by law. This is governed by your policy, so you
Right.
can decide what your policy means, you being the board.
Right, and how to present it to the public, how to make it available.
So I also feel that after looking through this, if we feel that it does not meet the policy, then we will recommend at the next meeting that we do an additional first reading. So we will look at it, analyze it, and if it does not meet our policy, with some legal review, then we'll do a first reading. If it does, we will present the various kind of options for a second reading.
There's one thing I was pondering whether it's relevant, and I think it is. With cyberbullying, I heard Mr. Rosenthal say that if it affects the student in school, that kind of makes my mind think that there are some parameters around what you are able to do as a school district in response to cyberbullying. Can you speak to that?
Sure, I can. Essentially, there's establishing a nexus to school within the bullying or any action. So that goes beyond just bullying. If there is a nexus to school established, then it becomes kind of the jurisdiction of the school district. Mr. Roos, can you further explain that, hopefully from a legal standpoint?
This actually is a matter of law, so
Thank
I'm
you.
happy to do
Thank
that. Yeah, it's actually in the policy, it's bullying, whether it's cyberbullying or bullying. If it happens outside of school, it would have to have the effect of either substantially interfering with a student's education, creating a threatening school environment, or substantially disrupting the orderly operation of the school. So there is some amount of outside of school bullying and cyberbullying that the school does have jurisdiction over which they can discipline. Having said that, there's also quite a bit of bullying and cyberbullying outside of school, which the school district not only doesn't have jurisdiction over, but as a practical matter, may not want to have jurisdiction over, because it enmeshes the school district in, the private affairs of of children outside of school that has nothing to do with school. So it's very case-specific, very fact-specific on a case-by-case basis. It's not clear-cut. There is a whole array of cases on these subjects. But the parameters exist. They're just not always clear on how to apply them.
I have a question for Mr. Sneed. Involving Google suites or suites, is there a way to identify students who are bullying and or cyberbullying during school or out of school, considering they use products from school, i.e. Chromebooks?
Not specifically. We don't have any tools in place that monitor for that type of behavior. There are products out there like that that have questionable use. So, you know, it's kind of contentious about using those things because it's invasion of privacy. Some look at it. So there are tools out there, but no, Google itself does not do that.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mowry?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Vacy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for the first reading of the student offenses and discipline policy?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the first reading of the board policy entitled Student Offenses and Discipline Procedures Policy as reflected in addendum number 14.2.
Second?
We have a second. Dr. Fetcher?
The policy regarding student offenses and discipline procedures is being presented tonight for a first reading. I'm going to ask Dr. Brown to please review the policy.
Thank you. Tonight, we share with you recommended revisions to the student offenses and discipline procedures policy. So the recommended format of this policy has changed. However, the substance of the listed offenses has not. So the revisions provide more options for principals and school administrators to utilize non-exclusionary measures like restorative practices or mediation or other alternatives for conduct that would have traditionally been resolved through suspension. So the accompanying SAP, which will be shared at the second read of the policy in August, provides greater clarity and transparency on the process for what those alternatives could be. And this revision makes it a little more clear for all stakeholders the sort of the flow of the infractions along with possible consequences for those infractions. So if you notice, it looks like all those infractions are crossed out, but that's just the change in format. As you continue to scroll, you'll see a table that will include all of those things. And if you look at the leveling tier of offenses, you know, if you scroll down to level 2, you know, those are offenses that previously by policy you could issue a suspension, and you still could. However, the way the policy and the SAP are composed, these offenses will now, you know, more commonly be resolved without a suspension. So for first time and non-major infractions. So, you know, a lot of the alternatives are things that have been piloted or tested in small formats in our schools. And we've learned a great deal from those alternatives over the past couple of school years. And now to encourage greater use of those and make more of an impact, the policy will allow and also encourage more of their usage. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Questions or comments from the board?
So would you say is in the new format, it's really set up as options of how you respond to each level?
Yes.
So it's nothing substantive, it's the same thing written up a different way and showing that you now have options for different levels, so that's all, right?
It's gonna greater spell out how to use those options as well, because, you know, like I mentioned, a lot of those things that we've been kind of testing were in either pilot or like an exploratory phase. So now that we've learned from those, we can actually utilize them systematically to make a greater impact. So it provides that clarity there through policy and will be further explained in the administrative procedures.
And I also want to add to that it's a response also from our input that we've received from our parent community as well, specifically on, it came out of some of the table talks as well, but feedback throughout the year of if this happens, what are some things that could occur, not just up to and including expulsion. That these are some alternatives that may happen, and it's a way of increasing our communication of options, not only to our administrators, but significantly to our parents as well, who have asked for just more clarity on the policy.
I'd just like to say that I appreciate the economical and accessible presentation or representation of this information in the revision to the policy. I think it makes a lot more sense, and I think it's much more accessible to people.
Yeah, spelling out the infractions through the tiers and the options and response to the infractions are going to be useful for the community.
Any other questions or comments? I have one in regard to restorative practices. I know pre-COVID, we started off with Copper Beach Elementary School with the teachers, the staff being trained there. Can you let me know where we are with getting our staff fully trained?
There has been training that has occurred for staff members at Overlook, for staff members at the middle school, as well as there's been some movement on the administrative team, but a lot of administrators in the districts have also received training. So it's not all the way complete in terms of like every teacher in the buildings having training, but there are folks in each of our buildings who have received training.
Thank you. Can you confirm if that's the goal? To get as many people trained as possible?
The goal is to get people trained, but we also have, so what I neglected to mention the first time is we had individuals trained as trainers as well. So we have the capacity to continue the training and continue to, to do that in all of our schools, yes.
Thank you. Any additional questions or comments from the board?
So the one consequence that I'm not comfortable with, and I understand the use of it, but for a level 1 loss of recess, that is the time for kids to go out and get some steam blown off. Like I will vote no to this because I can't support taking recess from kids as a consequence.
Any additional questions or comments from the board?
Mr. Allen, question, does that translate up to middle school and high school in terms of loss of other joy-based activities?
Being excluded from like a dance or something at night,
Yeah.
fine, I understand. But during the day, that is a period of time where kids, it's the only unstructured time where kids can just put their hair down, so to speak. And taking that from kids as a consequence from an in-class behavior, I understand the thought process. When I was an assistant principal, I did that myself. Having time to reflect on it, having read, reading about it, conversations with other educators, that's just not an appropriate response or consequence for students. School dance at night, not attending the football game, that kids have time to unwind and take a time out from school activities. But from within the day, that doesn't feel right to me. Imagine if in our work day, we had our only free time outside of lunch taken away from us. And we all have free time. It might not be structured because we don't all live to a bell schedule, but
We'd be more likely to follow the rules, I'm sure.
I can appreciate what you're saying, especially for the elementary grades. Yeah.
I have a question about, does anyone have a follow-up to what Brian is saying?
I just want to say that I can agree with that, especially for the elementary grades.
Just process-wise, if that is the only, I agree with you as well, Mr. Allen, but if we were to, this is just a first reading, if we were to give that feedback, would we have to do a new first reading? Or, not to like belabor this point.
I mean, I would imagine if that were
Sorry.
one piece of this recommended policy changed, and Mr. Roos, you can correct me if I'm not legal, I would assume that we could present it as a second reading based on the feedback that was presented here this evening from the board.
Or you could simply remove it before you approve it for first reading.
Oh.
That's the will of the majority of the board to remove that phrase. But
I would
either
like to
way.
remove that phrase.
I don't see any reason to remove
I
the
move to
phrase.
remove that phrase. What's that?
I don't see any reason to remove that phrase. I don't. I think it's fine.
Can I ask a clarifying question related to loss of recess?
Yes, you may.
So I hear Mr. Allen's point, and I think it's a well-made point. As I guess, generally speaking, the possible consequences are these things that came out of recommendations from teachers and parents and community? Are these recommendations based on researched best practices as it relates to consequences? Like how was this list decided? Because that may help me understand why loss of recess is one of the recommendations here.
The possible consequences came from what is presently available as consequences as listed in Skyward, as well as additions and changes recommended by our Principals Council and our administrative team.
I see. Okay.
So I just want, just for clarification purposes, I'm going to ask if there is an elementary principal who can describe what loss of recess means and what occurs during loss of recess. Is there someone here who's willing to describe that, since you are here? Anyone? Dr. Atlin?
Typically during a loss of recess, students will complete what is called a think sheet. At Highland, it's called a STARS form. But it's a way for them to reflect on their actions, how their actions impacted others, and what decisions or choices they could have made differently.
Any other additions to that?
I can also add it's our most common form of consequence for those first level offenses. If we do not have loss of recess as a consequence, we have nothing.
And I know it's because loss of recess is an easy thing to do. Like I said, when I was an assistant principal, I totally understand it was a tool in my toolbox. And if at the time the school board said you couldn't do it, I would lose my mind. But having read and punishing students by withholding physical activity is just not an appropriate consequence. And I would have figured out a way. My mind would have blown after hearing that from a school board meeting as an assistant principal, but I would have come up with other ways. Taking physical activity for a punitive action, as a punitive action, is just not, it doesn't sit with me today.
Just to provide one more point for clarification, there's a lot of teacher-handled behaviors that will occur before an offense gets to even be a level 1. So for like a minor classroom infraction, like that could just be a student and a teacher conference. So by the time something reaches that level, there may have already been 2, 3, and or 4 like interventions at either the classroom level before it reaches that point. So just to kind of outline when an offense would get to that level and what the possible consequences would be. That's not a justification for loss of recess, just to say like when something gets to that level.
Another piece to consider is, in conjunction, and Mr. Allen, to your point, and this is something that I would ask, I believe that we need to examine, is does this conflict with our wellness policy, and do a cross-read between the wellness policy and this policy. I can pull up the wellness policy, but I do believe that in the wellness policy, there is a lack of, it states something like that we cannot withhold physical activity as, as a punishment. So I think that what I would suggest at this point is that we will, one, do a cross-read of that, look at this item. I believe that we've received feedback from most of the board members in regard to this, and we can present that as well as some alternatives or alternatives to how it is written at right there. I do think that there is merit to that time period and having that unstructured time to do exactly what Dr. Etlin suggests is time for reflection, or a component of that. And also here on level 1, a lot of this is loss of time. So if you're late or cutting of classes or not where you're supposed to be, the last thing, what I've always done when I was a principal is say you need to make up that time somewhere. Like if you're constantly late for school, we're not going to suspend you for being late for school because then you're out more time. But that you would make up that time. So I would like to take some time to re-examine this point with the administrative team, and I believe that it would be considered a first reading, represent a first reading at the first meeting in August, and then with hopes that we have a conclusion of this by the second meeting in August, which affects, the start of the school year. And that's my biggest concern. The reason why this timing is this evening is to be able to have student handbooks communicated, those types of things. So it puts us in a little bit of a jam time-wise, if it requires a second reading. And I think we can discuss that as well. So I think we, in the interest of this meeting now and where we are, I would ask that that we take the feedback and present to you what I've heard here as feedback and some options.
Do we need a motion to table?
Oh, has it been moved and seconded already?
Yes.
Okay, then you would need a motion to table.
Motion to table?
Second.
All in favor, voice vote?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Opposed?
For the record, we have 8 in,
Actually, I oppose also. Excuse me.
one. May I have I want to go down the line, okay? Mrs. Young, would you like to help with that, please? Thank you.
Mr.
To table, right?
Voting to table.
Sure.
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
No.
Mr. Kay?
No.
Dr. Mowry?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
If we vote to table, does that mean that this will not be ready for the next school year?
No. Right?
Wouldn't be ready anyway.
I mean, our communication will be delayed. If it's the second board meeting in August, what's the date of the second board meeting in August? August 22nd. So in terms of what normally goes out in terms of our student handbooks and things like that, they're digital. They will be delayed, and that's the only, I just want to be transparent about that to our parent community, that we will do that and try to get things into place. But as far as communicating, we prefer to do that communication sooner. But we also want to make sure that the policy is reflective of the Board of School Directors as well as through the recommendations of the administration.
Okay, so delayed as in late August, not into the beginning of the school year.
I'm going through dates in I believe that we can turn around and do a communication, even if it's an addendum to things that we send out, prior to the start of the first day with students.
Okay. I'm going to vote in favor of tabling because I do think this is very important and I want to make sure we get this right.
We're finished with deliberations because we've
Oh,
already started voting.
apologies. Yes, in favor of tabling.
Thank you.
Mr. Muhammad?
Aye.
Ms. Fazy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and it will be tabled until the next meeting for first reading. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for the classification of fund balances?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors authorizes the estimated dollar amounts for the classification of fund balances in the General Fund and Capital Projects Fund, with the final fund balance dollar amounts being determined in concert with the local independent auditor's preparation of the audited annual financial report as reflected in addendum number 15.1, and authorizes the Chief Financial Officer to delineate estimated dollar amounts for the fund balance of the Special Revenue Fund, with the final fund balance amounts being determined in concert with the local independent auditor's preparation of the audited annual financial report.
Second.
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Mr. Lionetti, could you please review this item?
Yes, addendum 15.1 delineates the classifications of fund balance for the general fund and capital project funds for the 2022-2023 school year. Fund balance classifications are based on estimates, which will be refined and completed when we are working with our auditors for the final financial audited report in the fall.
Questions or comments from the board? Seeing that there are none, Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kite?
Aye.
Dr. Mowry?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Muhammad?
Aye.
Ms. Fazy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for the Taxpayer Relief Act?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors establishes the following homestead exclusion and farmstead exclusion for the 2022, should be 2023, right? Okay. For the 2023-2024 fiscal year, in that all eligible homesteads and eligible farmsteads shall receive a homestead and/or farmstead exclusion of $12,108 of the assessed value of the homestead and/or farmstead, which, based upon the millage rate established for the 2023-2024 fiscal year, corresponds to a tax reduction of $426. Furthermore, the tax collector shall itemize the exclusion on each eligible homestead and eligible farmstead owner's annual property tax bill showing the assessed value, the tax liability on the assessed value, the amount of the homestead and/or farmstead exclusion in assessed value, the actual tax liability after the homestead and/or farmstead exclusion, and the actual tax savings associated with the homestead and/or farmstead exclusion. Additionally, the tax collector shall have the following notice included with the annual property tax bills in July 2023 of all owners eligible homestead and/or farmstead properties and not included with interim tax bills. Notice of property tax relief. Your enclosed tax bill includes a tax reduction for your homestead and/or farmstead property. As an eligible homestead and/or farmstead property owner, you have received tax relief through a homestead and/or farmstead exclusion, which has been provided under the Pennsylvania Taxpayer Relief Act, a law passed by the Pennsylvania General Assembly designed to reduce your property taxes.
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Mr. Lionetti?
Yes, the resolution is prescribed in Act 1 of 2006. and it establishes the homestead rebate that was discussed in the budget presentation.
Thank you. Any additional questions or comments? Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mallory?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Fazy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for the Senior Citizens Real Estate Tax Rebate Program?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the attached resolution to establish a senior citizen real estate tax rebate program as reflected in addendum number 17.1.
Second?
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Mr. Vittoria, could you please review this item?
This is a formal resolution to establish a 40% rebate program that piggybacks on the Pennsylvania Department of Revenue real estate tax rebate program. The formal addendum was prepared by our solicitor.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing that there are none, Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mallory?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Fazy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for the real estate transfer tax?
I can. I feel like I'm reading a novel out loud tonight. In our next chapter, it is recommended that the Board of School Directors record officially in the minutes the provisions of Section 4 of the Act of Assembly of December 31st, 1956, PL 1257, known and cited as the Local Tax Enabling Act, as amended by Act Number 160 of October 1967, which provides, quote, "Every such tax shall continue in force on a calendar or fiscal year basis, as the case may be, without annual reenactment unless the rate of tax is subsequently changed." The terms, conditions, and provisions of the Abington School District Real Estate Transfer Tax Resolution were duly approved and adopted on May 27, 1968, and amended on June 24, 1986, January 13, 1987, and June 26, 2007.
Second?
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Mr. Lionetti, would you please review this item?
Yes, Dr. Fetcher, this resolution is required by law to generate the transfer real estate tax, which supports the expenses that were approved in your final general fund budget of 2023-24. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mallory?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Fazy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for the charge to tax collectors?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the charge to tax collectors J.W. Blumenthal of Abington Township and Albert Wortman of the Borough of Rockledge as reflected in addendum number 19.1.
Second?
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Mr. Lionetti?
Thank you, Dr. Fetcher. This is a two-page addendum, one each for the tax collector of Abington and one for the Borough of Rockledge. It delineates the required assessed value for the basis of the real estate tax invoices and the gross levy for each of those municipalities in support of the school district budget.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mallory?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Fazy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for Act 80 exceptions?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors authorizes the superintendent to request the Pennsylvania Department of Education to approve Act 80 exception days for the 2023-2024 school year according to the activities approved in Pennsylvania Statutes Title 24, PS Education Section 15-1504, as amended by Act 80 of 1969.
Second?
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. This request for an Act 80 exception permits us to use our in-service days or parent-guardian conferences that impact the educational program as a method to account for the possibility of fewer days than 180 days of instruction in the event of weather-related or other emergency situations that may occur during the 2023-2024 school year.
Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mowry?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Vacy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for federal grant applications?
As quickly as I can. It is recommended that the Board of School Directors authorize the Office of the Superintendent of Schools at no additional compensation to file applications for 2023-2024 federal grant funds for Titles 1, 2, 3, and 4 funds in accordance with the procedures administered through the Pennsylvania Department of Education, Division of Federal Grants.
Second?
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. As the recommended action suggests, this is to file the applications for the grant funds for Titles 1, 2, 3, and 4. We can answer any questions that you may have in regard to that item.
Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mowry?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Vacy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for the Abington Cyber Education Program?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors authorize the administration to enter into a one-year agreement with the Chester County Intermediate Unit for full-service online courses with computer, internet service, and textbook management through Brandywine Virtual Academy, provided that the services meet the district's academic requirements.
Second?
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. This is the continuation of our Abington Cyber Education Program that we offer to our students as an alternative.
Questions or comments from the board? Just as a reminder, this alternative saves money from students leaving the district should they prefer this cyber program, and the answer to that is yes. Any additional questions or comments from the board? Okay, I just want to make sure I leave time for questions. Seeing that there's none? Awesome.
Let's go.
Ms. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mowry?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Vacy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for authorization?
Madam President?
Yes.
Would it be possible to bundle it's probably not even the right word, bundle 24, 25, and 26, since they all relate to district security?
23 does
24.
not, so do you want to do, let's do 23, and then we can
Okay,
exit
I'll do
out.
23, and then can we do the
And then-
next three together?
Let's do 23 first, and then we can look at 24, 25, and 26.
All right.
Dr. Mowry, can you please read the recommendation for authorization of construction change directives?
It is recommended that the Board of School Directors authorizes the Superintendent of Schools to issue construction change directives at a value per contract not to exceed $10,000 until the next board meeting.
Second?
We have a second, Dr. Fetcher.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. The summer's construction projects include repaving a portion of Ghost Road. Since the board is not scheduled to meet until August 8th, 2023, it is requested that the superintendent be authorized to issue construction change directives with the understanding that they will be submitted to the board for review and confirmation at the next board meeting.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the board? Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mowry?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Vacy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. taken into consideration that 24, 25, and 26 all have to do with emergency operations and providing supports for those emergency operations. Please read them together.
Okay, so I just read the recommendations consecutively and then we take one, okay.
Yes, please.
All right, it is recommended that the Board of School Directors approves the revised Abington School District Emergency Operations Plan and authorizes the superintendent to submit a copy to the Montgomery County Office of Emergency Management, along with a signed copy of the review maintenances and concurrence document. It is also recommended that the Board of School Directors authorize the administration to enter into an agreement with Abington Township Police Department for school resource officer services based upon the rates and fees set forth in the agreement. It is also recommended that the Board of School Directors authorize the administration to enter into an agreement with U.S. Security Care, Inc. for school security services based upon the rates and fees set forth in the agreement.
Second?
We have a second for all three. Dr. Fetcher?
Thank you, Ms. Brown. The first number 24 is the District Emergency Operations Plan. This is updated every 2 years, and it's done by an emergency management team, which includes representatives throughout the Abington School District, as well as Abington Township and the Borough of Rockledge Police Departments and Abington Township Emergency Management. This team reviews the plan and ensures that we have proper emergency operations in place. Next is to continue our school resource officer agreement. This agreement is to have a school resource officer in Abington Middle School, as well as a school resource officer in Abington Senior High School. The next item is for school security services. This is for our security guards that are in Abington Middle School, as well as Abington Senior High School.
Thank you. Questions or comments from the board? Seeing that there are none, Mrs. Young?
Mr. Allen?
Aye.
Ms. Frazier?
Aye.
Mr. Kay?
Aye.
Dr. Mallory?
Aye.
Mrs. Glasser?
Aye.
Mr. Mohammed?
Aye.
Ms. Fazy?
Aye.
Dr. Kleiman?
Aye.
Mrs. Brown?
Aye, ayes have it, and motion passes. And that takes us to any additional reports or recommendations?
Make sure. Sorry. Yes. Just want to make sure I did this correctly. Sorry for the delay. I provide the conference attendance and professional leaves. I wanted to bring your attention on the professional leaves. Dr. Brown, who will be presenting at the Pennsylvania Summit for Educational Leaders, the Pennsylvania Principals Conference in King of Prussia on August 6th, 7th, and 8th. The presentation will focus on the role of the principal and equity initiatives in their building. The use of data that support all students in course enrollment, discipline analysis, and instructional practices will also be highlighted.
Thank you very much. Again, proud to see that we have people representing Abington well with what we do here. Any additional questions or comments from the board? Any other business to be appropriately brought up from my fellow board members at this time? Okay. Comments from citizens? Comments from citizens are being conducted both in person and by phone. The phone number to participate in public comment is 267-715-3717 and is featured on the screen at this time. You can call in your mobile or landline phone. If you're within the building, there are mics to the left and right of you. Please be sure to state your name and address.
Joe Rooney. I guess it's been a long meeting. I'll make it as long as possible then. A couple of short things. First, I know it's easy to vote for $200 a person tax or $200 a tax account tax increase for everybody. $200 for somebody making $20 an hour. That's an extra 10 hours of work plus what they pay in taxes. So you basically took a work day away from everybody if they're making 20 bucks an hour. The second one is you all pat yourself on the back about what an outstanding education, but you can't make the case. How do we measure that outstanding education to go from 130 or 120 million dollars up to 190 million bucks? The third one is you increase the millage rate by 4.1%. As houses get sold, increased value, then you're increasing the real estate transfer tax also. So you're not worried about an income problem. We have a spending problem. And it kind of goes along with the discussions we had between the difference between a board policy and a superintendent's administrative procedure. You guys are supposed to direct the school district on what they do, not ask Dr. Fetcher to write the board policy so that he can then write superintendent's administrative procedure. If Mr. Allen thinks that there shouldn't be a recess thing, the board directs the school district what to do. That's as simple as it is. I mean, you're saying then it doesn't even look like y'all are reading what the definition of what bullying was in the superintendent administrative procedure. That's like over a page long. It's incomprehensible. And Mr. Roos pointed out, somebody else did too. So all those little things, the board's supposed to direct. You're supposed to represent us and then direct the school district on how to proceed, not ask them what it is you all ought to do. It's all backwards here. And I know you don't care. Finally, the president says there's no dead wood. Yes, there is. Y'all aren't doing your work. Now, you're not being paid, okay? But you're not acting like your school directors. And there's a $190 million business right here. They're all government employees. If your point is there isn't any dead wood in it, then that's got to be incredible. There's a thing called the Pareto principle. 80% of the work's done by 20% of the people. The other 80% of the people do 20% of the work. That's a definition of what that is, and it carries across even government employees. So there's definitely ways, if the board actually directed somebody to do something, knew what was going on, to get cost savings and actually increase the education. That's true. That's how it is. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you for your voice. Mr. Sneed, can you confirm that there are no callers on the line?
That is confirmed.
Thank you. I see another person within the room.
I don't think it was in the documents, but.
I'm sorry, can you please be sure to state your name?
Arthur Bear in Abington. There was a mention that there were 2 elementary school guidance counselors hired for the next year. Were they replacements or are they new positions? And also the estimated cost of a person making $80,000 is roughly double that. So, when you consider the administration to teacher ratio, that's thumbnail, $150,000. Thank you.
Thank you for your voice. Any other speakers within the room? And no callers on the line?
Correct.
Thank you. Dr. Fetcher?
Thank you, Ms. Brown. First, to speak to why we feel that a measurement of the success of our program here at Abington School District, and I would like to point to our graduation and the future plans of our students in college acceptances, as well as scores on AP exams and the amount of scholarships that our students received for higher education. I think that is a testament to a K-12 education. And when I have the opportunity at our graduation to look at the future plans of our students, be it higher education, military service, or trades, it is a testament to what we do. And that is our end goal from K to 12, to educate our students, to provide programming that prepares them for life. And part of that next step are the acceptances into institutions of higher ed. So I just would be remiss if I left this evening without that, especially just having had the opportunity to be at our graduation, to look at the future plans of our students and the support that they've received to get to that level, and have conversations with students who may not have thought that they could achieve certain things, and because of the support systems in place and because of their education, they are able to look at these future plans, and which will have an ultimate effect on their life. In terms of looking at our employees, I would point to the fact that we do have a comprehensive evaluation process in place, and if people are not performing at a level that is expected or directed to them, there is a process in place for that, and that's noted through our evaluation process that we have here. It's a very formal process, as well as if there are incidents with employees that are not following directives or not following board policy. There are times when there are disciplinary actions and consequences that occur for those individuals. And some of them could even lead to dismissal of an individual based on that. So I feel strongly that we do have a comprehensive evaluation process, and that if our employees are not working up to their level of expectation or not following our policies, that we take that very seriously and have plans in place. Sometimes there's a need for an improvement plan. Sometimes if there's a violation of policy or law, that will, as I mentioned, lead to dismissal. The final component that I would like to speak about is the guidance counselor positions. They are new positions. However, they are not newly created positions within the district. However, they are taking the place of old positions. So we have reallocated our funds through our equivalents of positions to this area. This has been an ongoing process that has occurred over the past few years with great input and also recommendations from the Board of School Directors to constantly look at ways that we could accomplish this goal. So a few years ago, we set out to do this, and at that time, we didn't add 7 guidance counselors because we were going to roll it out as fiscally responsible as we could, and in a process over time. And so these 3 positions, the guidance positions that I spoke about tonight that are included in this budget, are taken from the reallocation of positions from the past.
Thank you. That brings us to closing comments from my fellow board members. Mr. Allen,
Have a nice summer.
Ms. Frazier.
Abington Education Foundation, they have plenty of opportunities that will be coming up in the fall as fundraisers, but fun for engagement with those in our community.
Thank you. Mr. Kay.
No, thank you.
Dr. Mowry. Dr. Mowry. Sure.
I'd like to wish everyone a good summer, and we'll see you in August.
Thank you. Ms. Glasser.
Nothing at this time, thank you.
Mr. Muhammad.
Everyone have a beautiful summer. To our students and parents. For a long time, in our society, we have this notion that studying stops when June wraps up and that learning only occurs in the classroom. But the world is your classroom. Studying never stops. Summer learning is key, and it will prevent the summer slide that we know is so very real. So take part in cultural enrichment. You live in a historic city or near a historic city, get those cultural and history tours in here or wherever you may end up. Journal, write, engage in rich conversations, engage in the arts, find the math all around us, as I know President Brown loves to say, and pick up a fun book. The learning doesn't stop, the studying never stops. Enjoy your summer.
Thank you. Ms. Fazy?
Everyone enjoy your summer.
Dr. Kleiman?
I hope everyone has a great summer, and I hope that we all remember that just because we might not always agree doesn't mean that the folks with whom you disagree are idiots. So I hope everyone enjoys their time over the summer. I look forward to seeing you in August.
Thank you. Dr. Fetcher?
Following that, first, I'd like to wish everyone a great summer, and to Mr. Muhammad's point, the Fetcher children will be experiencing educational experiences on multiple levels in the classroom during the summer, as well as outside of the classroom. So if they are watching, which I doubt it at this point, only my mother is watching still, that, you know, we do have a lot of opportunities for our students out there, on a serious note, and we are highlighting them and some of the experiences that students are having. So I just, parents who are out there, we have a social media campaign to kind of share some of those ideas of experiences that people are having throughout the time, not in the official school calendar, but still learning. Thank you.
Excellent. Have a great summer. It is a pleasure to serve. You deserve a break. This meeting is adjourned.